Whether they give insight into a life cut short by tragedy, offer wisdom from considerable lived experience, or remain a mystery, the last words of notable people are incredibly fascinating.
The death of Marvin Gaye is one of the most notorious murders in music history. Here's what we know about his final moments and his final words. On April 1, 1984, a retired minister, Marvin Gaye Sr., shot his son Marvin Gaye twice with a .38 caliber pistol. His son slumped down against the far wall and lay there bleeding out. The gun had been a present from his son for Christmas that year. Marvin Gaye, the musical legend known as the Prince of Motown, died a day before his 45th birthday. His father shot him in what some saw as an inevitable outcome of their troubled relationship. Gaye had gone so far as adding an E to the end of his name to distance himself from the man who had abused him his whole life. Gaye was born on April 2, 1939 in Washington, D.C., and suffered under the strict corporal punishment liberally doled out by his father. Even before his son was born, Marvin Gaye Sr. already seemed to have a problem with him. Alberta Cooper Gaye told David Ritz in his book, Divided Soul, The Life of Marvin Gaye, "My husband never wanted Marvin, and he never liked him." Marvin Gaye Sr. even went so far as telling Alberta he didn't believe Marvin was his son. Gaye's father was a minister in the Hebrew Pentecostal Church, but that didn't stop him from physically abusing his children or becoming violent when he overconsumed alcohol. Marvin Gaye found solace in music at church and believed he could win his father's love through singing.
In this life, I love music, and music is my love. You know, it's all I know.
Still, the better he became, the more demands his father made on him. If not for Gaye's mother, Alberta, who consoled and supported her son, Gaye himself claimed he might have died by suicide as a child. Instead, Gaye, tired of his father's abuse, quit school at age 17, ran away from home, and joined the U.S. Air Force, which ended disastrously with Gaye faking a mental illness to get a discharge. By the early 1960s, Marvin Gaye had found a home at Motown Records, starting as a session drummer before making the leap to singer. He had a string of hits in the 1960s with songs like I Heard It Through the Grapevine and Ain't No Mountain High Enough, a duet with Tammy Terrell. His success only grew into the 1970s with What's Going On and Let's Get It On. The more successful Marvin Gaye became, however, the more his father seemed to resent him. By 1981, Marvin Gaye had become addicted to cocaine, declared bankruptcy, and endured 2 failed marriages. Moreover, the IRS hit him with a massive fine for unpaid back taxes, and he eventually attempted suicide. Later, he moved to Belgium, got clean, and made a comeback with the 1982 album Midnight Love and its mega-hit Sexual Healing. Unfortunately, once he was back in the music scene, he began using cocaine again. The last 4 months of his life he spent living at the Los Angeles home he had bought for his parents. Living under the same roof, Marvin Gaye and his father's relationship disintegrated once more. The final fight between Marvin Gaye and his father began on Saturday night, March 31, 1984, when the elder man became angry with Alberta over some missing insurance papers. The fight continued the next day and became physical. Gaye Sr. later alleged that Marvin Gaye had been punching and kicking him. Marvin Gaye Sr. then left. Soon after, he came back into the bedroom and shot his son. Alberta called Gaye's younger brother, Frankie, who lived next door. As Frankie held his dying brother's head in his lap, Marvin told him, "I got what I wanted. I couldn't do it myself, so I made him do it." Marvin Gaye Sr. later pleaded no contest to 1 count of involuntary manslaughter, was given 5 months of probation, and died in 1998 at 83. At his sentencing, he said, "I'm sorry, I loved him. If I could bring him back, I would." The Challenger and Columbia space shuttle disasters served as sobering reminders that space exploration was still a new and a dangerous endeavor. But just as devastating as these 2 tragedies was the Apollo 1 catastrophe, which led to the deaths of its promising 3-man crew. Back in 1967, 2 years before the historic 1969 moon landing, Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward H. White, and Roger B. Chaffee died while conducting training exercises in their spacecraft at Cape Kennedy Launch Complex 34. Grissom was open and realistic about the danger.
There is some risk. I recognize it, but just try to take as much of that out as we can during the pre-testing.
As with the later deaths of the crews of the Challenger and Columbia spacecraft, a NASA investigation at the time concluded that Grissom, White, and Chaffee fell victim to, quote, technical and management lapses.
There were problems that people knew about, but they hadn't been able to slow the train that was barreling down the track.
The 3 men died before anyone could attempt to save their lives, but they were aware of what was happening and left us with some final words. The launch, officially named the Apollo 204 mission, was going to be the first manned Apollo mission in space. At 6:31 p.m. on January 27th, 3 weeks ahead of the crew's intended launch on February 21st, Grissom, White, and Chaffee sat in their craft on their launch pad going through a countdown simulation. There were 0 indications that anything was wrong with the spacecraft.
Then, there's a surge of voltage somewhere in the electrical system.
As the story goes, there was some worn wiring beneath Grissom's seat which had lost its insulation and was exposed to the air as electricity ran through the live wire. Crews outside sealed the module's 3 hatches and filled the air inside with pure oxygen. Then a small movement caused the exposed wire to spark, igniting the highly oxygenated atmosphere. And because oxygen makes things burn very quickly in its pure form, there was plenty of fuel for the fire to consume. The module cracked open and smoke started pouring out. The crew inside yelled for help and tried opening the hatches to escape, but to no avail. As NBC News recounts, brief cries from the crew came over the headsets. White yelled, "Fire!" and Grissom followed.
Fire in the cockpit!
Chaffee echoed, "Fire!" and the sound gets muddled from there. According to NBC News, Chaffee yelled, "Get us out!" while Astronomy.com says he yelled, "Let's get out!" Some accounts of the tragedy omit Chaffee's final line, but the New York Times says that before the crew lost contact with the outside, his last words were, "Hey, we're burning up."
Can you get him out of this?
Crew, doctors, and rescue personnel raced to the scene, hoping to safely extract the 3-person crew, but it took 5 minutes to reach the men, and by then it was too late. Ultimately, Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee didn't die from burns, but asphyxiation. The module had been filled with combustible material, and the flames had quickly burned through the hyper-oxygenated air in the environment, leaving no oxygen for the astronauts to breathe.
That fire erupted. It was an explosive combustion.
The following year, in 1968, another Apollo launch successfully lifted off from that very platform. But in 1969, the year of the moon landing, the platform was decommissioned. By 1972, every part of the platform except the cubical concrete support structure was removed. Now, that structure has a memorial plaque embedded on its surface that, along with the lost astronauts' names, reads, "Dedicated to the living memory of the crew of the Apollo 1. They gave their lives in service to their country in the ongoing exploration of humankind's final frontier. Remember them not for how they died, but for those ideals for which they lived." In 2017, there was a memorial service at the site which was attended by Grissom's wife, who was 89 at the time. According to the New York Times, she said, "I don't want any of this forgotten. Gus Grissom was a human being." The Apollo 1 disaster might have wound up saving people later on. As a result of the accident, NASA established both the Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance Office and an independent safety board, the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel. It also made many other changes to procedures, equipment, and materials, right down to astronaut spacesuits.
A horrifying accident, now an infamous tragedy with a haunting ending. The Titanic's captain uttered something rather ominous before the ship went down. When the Titanic struck an iceberg just after 11:30 p.m. on April 14, 1912, the impact felt like little more than a slight jarring to those aboard. Below deck, it was another story. The luxury passenger liner, which was the jewel of the British White Star Line, helmed by Captain Edward John Smith, was on its maiden voyage from Southampton, England to New York City, when the partially submerged mountain of ice tore into the ship's hull about 400 miles south of Newfoundland, Canada. Thomas Andrews, Titanic's head designer, went below to assess the damage, and what he saw floored him. He ran to tell Captain Smith that seawater was pouring into the boiler room near the ship's bow, as well as in the room next door, because the iceberg punched through 6 watertight compartments. Captain Smith immediately understood this meant that the Titanic was doomed. Andrews believed that they had only 60 to 90 minutes before the ship would sink, so Smith began evacuating his ship. The crew members rounded up the women and children first, corralled them into the lifeboats, and prioritized first-class passengers. The captain, meanwhile, ordered the crew to send out distress signals and fire rockets. He still held out hope of rescue even as the lifeboats below hit the icy water. Captain Edward Smith, born on January 27, 1850, was a seasoned sailor who began his naval career as a teenager. He had been with the White Star Line for nearly 40 years. His crew respected him, and he was beloved by passengers, especially the ones in first class, even earning the title the Millionaire's Captain per Britannica. While the Titanic disaster was by far his worst accident at sea, it wasn't his first. On more than one occasion, his ships had run aground, and on September 20, 1911, Smith was captain of the White Star passenger liner Olympic when it collided with the Royal Navy cruiser Hawke near the Isle of Wight in the English Channel, causing extensive damage to both ships. The Royal Navy blamed the Olympic for the accident, and the ensuing legal defense, as well as repairs, were financially hard on the company. White Star backed their captain, who would contend that his record at sea was unblemished. According to Encyclopedia Titanica, Smith said, "When anyone asks me how I can best describe my experience in nearly 40 years at sea, I merely say uneventful. In all my experience, I've never been in any accident or any sort worth speaking about." However, as the clock ticked into the early morning hours of April 15, 1912, Smith must have realized that his tenure as a ship's captain was coming to an end.
Right ahead!
While the Titanic continued to sink, the wireless operators stayed at their stations, desperately trying to send out distress messages over their radio transmitters in any hope of rescue. Just after 2 a.m., Captain Smith came in and relieved them of their duties so they could attempt to save themselves. Below deck, the engineers stayed at their posts, attempting to pump the water out, which helped ensure the power stayed on for as long as possible. Even the ship's musicians stayed at their posts, playing music to calm the wildly panicked passengers. With no help left, Captain Smith apparently told his crew per the Mirror, "Well, boys, you've done your duty and done it well. I ask no more of you. I release you. You know the rule of the sea. It's every man for himself now, and God bless you." What happened next remains clouded in myth and mystery. Various sources allege that a rush of water swept Smith overboard, that he died by suicide, or that he jumped from the deck with a child in his arms whom he placed in one of the lifeboats. The version most historians seem to agree with comes from an eyewitness. Harold Bride, the surviving wireless operator, said that Smith dove into the sea from the bridge, per history. Smith, along with nearly 700 of the ship's crew members, died. Was she really a lover of cake, or did rumors usurp her actual last words? Marie Antoinette's final statement isn't what you might think. The French Revolution was one of the most violent revolutions of its time period. It was caused by a perfect storm of problems, from financial issues due to preceding wars, political instability, food shortages, and new ideas stemming from philosophers all across Europe. Meetings among government leaders, aristocrats, and notable members of the bourgeoisie didn't help ease the tension. Some deputies representing commoners created their own organization. King Louis XVI convinced those representing clergy and nobles to join the new National Constituents Assembly, while simultaneously preparing troops against it. This assembly did away with the feudal system and allowed for more voting eligibility among citizens. Meanwhile, food supplies continued to dwindle. On July 14, 1789, Parisians rioted at the Bastille, a prison that they viewed as a symbol of the monarchy. The National Constituents Assembly tried to create a government wherein the king or monarch could share power with such an assembly, but King Louis XVI's advisors had their own ideas. War also broke out between France, Austria, and Austria's ally Prussia. King Louis XVI's wife, Marie Antoinette, who was born in Austria, suggested that her brother, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II, invade France to help counter the revolution. However, that did not happen, and the royal family was imprisoned in 1792. By the end of that year, another assembly formed called the National Convention, and it planned to end the monarchy in France. The new assembly charged the king with treason and beheaded him with the guillotine in January 1793. The assembly leaders moved Marie Antoinette to the Conciergerie, a large complex along the River Seine in Paris. There, she was separated from her family and isolated from other prisoners. 2 months later, the National Convention accused Antoinette of financial squandering, treachery, and even incest with her son, Louis XVII. Despite her emotional appeals to the citizens, she was executed in the same way as her husband, at the Place de la Concorde in Paris. Marie Antoinette remained calm when she was taken to the guillotine on October 16, 1793. Her last words were apparently directed to her executioner after she accidentally stepped on his foot. According to world history, she said, "Pardon, monsieur, I did not do it on purpose." Today, Place de la Concorde is a lively pedestrian area in the heart of Paris, just walking distance from the Louvre Museum and the Arc de Triomphe. It features fountains and an Egyptian obelisk, which is over 3,000 years old. There is little indication that the place was originally used for revolutionary executions. There is, of course, another quote more commonly associated with Marie Antoinette, which has regularly been recreated on screen. In the years leading up to the deaths of Antoinette and the king, failed crops caused food shortages among French citizens. A rumor spread that upon being informed about starving citizens, Antoinette replied,
"Let them eat cake."
Such a statement enraged her subjects as they pictured her luxurious life in comparison to their struggles. But multiple historians believe this to be out of character for the queen, as she held charitable causes in high regard throughout her life. The phrase had also already existed before Antoinette supposedly said it, as other historical figures have been attached to similar statements as well. It would seem that Antoinette's cordial, gentle last words are perhaps more reflective of her personality and legacy. The French Revolution was disturbingly violent. Other than Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, approximately 17,000 people were executed by the end of the revolution. A driving force behind a substantial number of these executions was Maximilien Robespierre, who led the Committee for Public Safety in 1793. He ordered those he deemed political enemies to be executed, often with the guillotine. The National Convention eventually turned on him, and he was executed along with dozens of his allies in 1794. Despite the initial anger toward Antoinette, she remains a well-recognized figure in French history, who's viewed with a little more sympathy now than she was during her lifetime. A vicious assassination, a brutal beheading, and the firing squad. What did these royals say when they faced death? Thanks to a complicated web of European alliances, Franz Ferdinand's assassination in 1914 led directly to World War I. But the assassination was much more chaotic and had more victims than many might know. A group of Serbian radicals decided to kill the royal when he was in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was then a part of the Austrian Empire. The attack was actually conceived as a bombing, and indeed there was a bomb. It did not get to its intended target, though. Not knowing what it was, Franz Ferdinand actually swatted the small bomb away when he saw a projectile heading toward his wife, Sophie, who was also in the car. The resulting explosion did, however, wound many innocent victims who had come to see him drive by in his open car. After the explosion, the Archduke actually got out to try and help those who were injured before continuing on to his original destination. Later that day, Franz Ferdinand changed his official schedule to go see the bombing victims in the hospital. This time, the car drove past another member of the terror cell, Gavrilo Princip, who shot both the Archduke and his wife. According to Sarajevo, the story of a political murder, as the dying Franz Ferdinand was rushed away for help, he kept repeating in German, "It is nothing." As rulers of Scotland and England, when they were still two separate countries, Mary, Queen of Scots, and Queen Elizabeth I of England were natural rivals, even though they were also first cousins once removed. After years of political machinations in Scotland, Mary fled to England, where she was locked up by Elizabeth. The English queen tried to avoid executing her cousin, but when Mary was implicated in a plot against Elizabeth, it was clear she was a danger to her throne and had to go. It was perhaps ironic that Mary was sentenced to die by beheading, as Elizabeth's mother Anne Boleyn had also been.
Mary Stuart is condemned to death.
Mary's final hours on February 8, 1587 were recorded in great detail. According to Elizabeth and Mary, Cousins, Rivals, Queens by Jane Donne, a dean from the Church of England tried to get her to convert before her execution, but the staunchly Catholic Mary refused. According to the 1923 book Trial of Mary, Queen of Scots, she faced death bravely. While all her attendants were crying, Mary insisted she was about to be very happy. She wore bright red petticoats, clearly a commentary on her fate. She tried to get the whole thing over with quickly, laying her head on the block and repeating Jesus' last words in Luke 23:46, which translate to, "O Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." George V died in 1936, and for decades his death was put down to natural causes. In reality, as the New York Times reported in 1986, the king's doctor recorded in his notes that he gave the unconscious dying man a lethal overdose. Original reporting on George's final words were as sanitized as his cause of death, with the public told that at the very end, George was still thinking about the state of the realm. Later, the public somehow started a rumor that the king's last words were actually "Bugger Bogner." Bognor Regis is a coastal town that was considered a good place for invalids to recuperate. The story was therefore that when it was recommended to the dying George that he go there to recover, he told the individual what he thought of that idea. However, the same doctor's notes that revealed how the king really died also included a detail on his last words. As he lost consciousness for what would be the final time, he said, "God you."
The king is dead.
Being one of Napoleon Bonaparte's best friends could be a lucrative position. For a while at least. One of his favorites was Joachim Murat, who Napoleon made king of Naples when he took over the country. Normally, Napoleon appointed one of his siblings to run places. In Naples, however, he gave the crown to Murat in 1808. The two were not related by blood, only by marriage, since Murat's wife was Napoleon's youngest sister, Caroline Bonaparte. While Murat actually did some good things while in charge of Naples, politics in Europe was a whirlwind in the early 1800s. Murat lost his throne in 1815, and when he tried to take it back, he was apprehended. In the History of Napoleon Bonaparte, John S.C. Abbott wrote that Murat was sentenced to death by firing squad. Murat turned down a blindfold, then spoke to the men aiming the guns at him, saying, "Save my face, aim at my heart." Once a concubine for Emperor Wenzhog of Qing, Empress Dowager Cixi managed to overcome centuries of tradition and take power for herself, first alongside another former concubine in 1861, then on her own. It was unheard of for a female ruler to take control, and technically, according to China Under the Empress Dowager by J.O.P. Bland and E. Backhouse, there was a male emperor. Ciji's son became Tongji Emperor, but as he was only 5 years old at the time, power flowed through his mother. After her son died in 1875, Cixi simply placed different young male relatives on the throne in turn, so it was really she who stayed in charge for decades. Cixi held on to power until her death in 1908. Considering how calculatingly and methodically she as a woman had gone after and consolidated power, Ciji's official last words were hypocritical to say the least. She said, "Never again allow any woman to hold the supreme power in the state. It is against the house law of our dynasty and should be strictly forbidden." To be fair to Cixi, it was not women who were her greatest concern for the royal family. That would be eunuchs, since she added, "Be careful not to allow eunuchs to meddle in government matters. The Ming dynasty was brought to ruin by eunuchs, and its fate should be a warning to my people." France's Louis XIV. He built the Palace of Versailles into the giant golden building tourists flock to today, put the hairbands of the 1980s to shame with his coif, and consolidated power despite being only 4 years old when he took the throne. However, one thing Louis didn't do was say the most famous quote ascribed to him, which translates to, "I am the state." However, he made up for it with his final words. Louis's last years had been sad, with many of his relatives dying young in a difficult war. But on his deathbed in 1715, aged 76, Louis still understood his place and purpose in life. Speaking in French, he said, "I am leaving, but the state will always remain." They were virtually perfect last words for a monarch who had effectively made himself the center of France's world. However, considering he thought of the state firmly in terms of the monarchy, he was also wrong. In 1789, the French Revolution ended the rule of the royal family.
To the barricades! Vive la France!
Empress Elizabeth of Austria, popularly known as Sissy, was set up to have a perfect life, at least on paper. She was stunningly beautiful and came from a wealthy, important family. When Emperor Franz Joseph, 7 years her senior, met Elizabeth for the first time, he fell in love at first sight and refused to marry anyone else. So, in 1854, Elizabeth became Empress of one of the most powerful countries in Europe. What followed was a deeply difficult time. Sissy's mother-in-law hated her. The aristocrats and others in her social class hated her. Her only son, Crown Prince Rudolph, died in a murder-suicide in 1889 along with his lover, and Elizabeth's own death would be just as violent. In 1898, the Empress was in Switzerland traveling under a fake name with her friend and attendant Countess Irma Stare, according to the book Elizabeth, Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary. However, her real identity got out, and Italian anarchist Luigi Lucchini decided to kill her. While waiting to board a ship, he got close enough to Elizabeth to stab her in the chest. As Elizabeth collapsed, the Countess didn't even realize anything was wrong. Thinking the Empress had only fainted, she was rushed onto the boat where she collapsed again. Finally seeing blood on her clothes, she asked, bewildered, "What has happened?" She then lost consciousness and died a few hours later. Considering how he lived, it's frankly astonishing that George IV survived as long as he did. He drank and ate to such a degree that by the end of his life in 1830, he refused to go out in the society he loved because of how large he had become. According to The Age of Scandal by T.H. White, he was also losing his sight and to some extent his mind. The 1926 biography George IV supports this last point, saying that while the king had always been fond of exaggerating, as he slowly died over the course of weeks, fantasies he told his visitors about his achievements became more ridiculous. He even claimed that he played a key role at the Battle of Waterloo, despite having never left England during the conflict with Napoleon. George's death was long and drawn out, so much so that even his former non-royal wife Maria Fitzherbert had time to learn he was gravely ill, travel to London, and write him, hoping to be called to see him before he died. Based on his last words, it's clear that George's doctors downplayed just how dire a situation the king was in, or at least how much time he really had left. On June 26th, he suddenly woke up after sleeping a full 24 hours and shouted, "This is death! Oh God, they have deceived me." Ulysses S. Grant's agonizing thirst for water, Pennsylvania treasurer's live TV suicide, and Winston Churchill's frank admission of boredom. These and other politicians left chilling remarks just before their last breath. Ulysses S. Grant, victorious general of the Civil War and President of the United States, was a big fan of cigars. In his retirement after leaving the White House, Grant had 20 cigars lined up on his desk every morning, and by the end of the day, he would smoke all of them. Sadly, Grant eventually developed throat cancer. According to his wife Julia, in the summer of 1884, Grant's symptoms came on suddenly while eating a peach. She recalled, He started up as if in great pain. He walked up and down the room and out to the piazza and rinsed his throat again and again. He was in great pain and said water hurt like fire. Fire was an understatement. The cancer made it in agony. As Grant himself wrote in a letter, "Nothing gives me so much pain as swallowing water. If you can imagine what molten lead would be going down your throat, that is what I feel when swallowing." This made Grant's last word before his 1885 death all the more impactful. As the end came near, he said, "Water." On the 100th anniversary of Michael Collins' death, Irish Taoiseach Micheál Martin praised him at a memorial event, calling him a hero. Not all of Ireland felt that way in 1922, however. Collins was a leader of the independence movement, but in 1921 he made the controversial decision of signing a treaty with the British. On August 24, 1922, Collins was traveling in a heavily fortified convoy. Forced to take back roads, the cars drove right into an ambush. An estimated 200 Irish fighters who had found themselves at odds with Collins shot at the party, hitting Collins in the head. Before he died, he was reported to have said, "Forgive them, bury me in Glasnevin with the boys." However, some noted that these words are a bit too on the nose when it comes to a perfect, memorable last statement in a terrifying moment. The historian and Irish Civil War expert Diarmaid Ferriter called these supposed last words classic propaganda. On October 30, 1984, India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi told a crowd of supporters, "I'm not interested in a long life. I'm not afraid of these things. I don't mind if my life goes in the service of this nation. If I die today, every drop of my blood will invigorate the nation." Her statement proved prophetic. The next morning, Gandhi was assassinated. For 2 years, some militant Sikhs had been rebelling against Gandhi's government, turning their religion's golden temple into an armed compound. In 1984, Gandhi ordered Indian troops to take back the temple by force, and hundreds died, mostly Sikhs. It was notable to those around her that after this bloody event, she still used Sikh bodyguards. Some questioned the decision, but she believed it was important symbolically to help heal the nation. But the men wanted vengeance. On October 31st, Gandhi came down in the morning and greeted her 2 bodyguards. In response, they drew their guns and shot her to death. Her last word was the traditional Hindu greeting, "Namaste."
In spite of our best efforts, we could not save her, and she expired at about 2:23.
There are few events in history that have been more minutely analyzed than the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963. As Kennedy's motorcade drove through Dealey Plaza, Lee Harvey Oswald shot and killed Kennedy from the Book Depository building. Oswald was captured shortly thereafter and then murdered by Jack Ruby while being transported. From this, 1,000 conspiracy theories blossomed. But for all the details about the Kennedy assassination that you probably know just from existing in a world that is obsessed with it, you know the president's last words, even though his widow, Jackie Kennedy, publicly revealed them during her testimony before the Warren Commission. According to the former First Lady, right before the shots, the wife of the governor of Texas, who was in the limousine with them, said to the president, "You certainly can't say that the people of Dallas haven't given you a nice welcome." Asked what the president replied, Jackie answered, "I think he said, I don't know if I remember it or I've read it. No, you certainly can't," or something. While her memories are the best available source, her response also shows how trauma can warp those memories, so we may never know for sure exactly what was said. Benazir Bhutto was the first woman elected to lead a majority Muslim country when she became Prime Minister of Pakistan in 1988. She served 2 non-consecutive terms, but things became more complicated after that. In self-imposed exile, she claimed Prime Minister Pervez Musharraf called to intimidate her in 2007, saying, "He threatened me. He told me not to come back. He warned me not to come back." She ignored the threats in return. On December 27th, Bhutto attended a political rally. After her speech, as she left the rally, she again waved through the vehicle's sunroof and shouted, "G.A. Bhutto." She was yelling this, which translates to "Long live Bhutto," when an assassin fired at her. Fellow politician Safdar Abbasi was in the car with Bhutto and told the Sunday Telegraph, "She did not say anything more. There was the sound of firing. I heard the sound of a bullet. I saw her. She looked as though she ducked in when she heard the firing. We did not realize that she had been hit by a bullet." Her assassin, a 15-year-old boy, then blew himself up with a suicide vest, killing more than a dozen other people. Musharraf denied having anything to do with Bhutto's assassination, though Bhutto's son told CNN that Musharraf was behind it.
You blame him for your mother's death?
He murdered my mother.
In 2013, Musharraf was indicted for her murder. He ultimately died in exile in 2023. Pennsylvania treasurer is not the first role one thinks of when it comes to politicians, but in 1987, R. Bud Dwyer made sure that he would never be forgotten. Having been recently convicted on corruption charges, Dwyer called a press conference. But as he gave a long speech that meandered, some of the reporters got visibly bored. That's when Dwyer pulled a gun out of a manila envelope. At first, it seemed like he was going to fire into the crowd, but he assured them that was not the plan. As some people rushed forward to stop him, Dwyer exclaimed, "Don't, this will hurt someone." Then he died by suicide on live television. Before the news conference, Dwyer gave his deputy press secretary Greg Penny an envelope containing his organ donor card. But in the end, due to procedural delays, only his corneas and ear cartilage could be donated. Penny told Penn Live in 2022, "That was another sad thing. Here was something he wanted to do as a gesture. It didn't happen the way he wanted to." By the time the end came for Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez on March 5, 2013, he'd been suffering for a long time. 2 years earlier, he had announced on television that he had already undergone surgery for pelvic cancer. After that, he needed repeated rounds of chemotherapy and surgeries as the cancer kept returning. By the end of 2012, it was impossible to hide the fact that he was extremely unwell and most likely dying. The government even released a photo of Chavez with a breathing tube. General Jose Ornella Ferreira was with Chavez when he died. Despite his cancer battle, it was a heart attack that would be the leader's cause of death. The day before, Chavez went into a coma. Before that, he managed to get his last words across. According to Ferreira, he couldn't speak, but he said it with his lips. "I don't want to die. Please don't let me die," because he loved his country. He sacrificed himself for his country. The revolution that took place on August 4, 1983, brought a young army officer named Thomas Sankara to power in the West African country that would come to be known as Burkina Faso. He took power at a difficult time in the continent's history, but planned radical improvement projects for his country. Under his program, millions of people were vaccinated, infant mortality plummeted, and he started unraveling ties with colonial power France. However, these good works did not make Sankara popular with everyone in the country. Some had been doing well for themselves under French imperialism and would be happy to go back. Others were forced to comply with new directives through coercive measures. And the military, broadly speaking, was not a fan of Sankara. A journalist later reported what happened on the last day Sankara was alive. It seemed like a regular day, full of meetings, making plans with his wife, and taking a nap. His 4:30 p.m. meeting was supposed to be quick, but it had barely started when those present heard a car approaching the building. There were gunshots, and someone demanded those inside come out. Sankara said, "Stay, it's me they want." He walked out of the room with his hands raised, but a surviving witness said he had barely stepped out of the door before he was shot. The attackers had come to kill. Nancy Astor was born and raised in the United States, but her second husband, Waldorf Astor, whom she married in 1906, was British. Nancy threw herself into the political scene in the UK, as Waldorf was a member of parliament. But when Waldorf's father died in 1919, he became a Viscount and had to give up his elected position to sit in the House of Lords, as there are rules against aristocracy sitting in the House of Commons. Nancy seemed to be the perfect candidate to replace him, despite the fact that no woman had ever been elected to parliament before. Indeed, only about 2/3 of the women in the UK were allowed to vote, and even that had only been the case for a year after a long struggle for equal voting rights.
I realized that I was there because of what they'd done, and that gave me great courage.
Nancy won the election in a landslide and took her place in Parliament, where she stayed until 1945. She used soft diplomacy to influence foreign policy while concentrating her activities on education and temperance. She also famously had problems with her social acquaintance, Winston Churchill. In April 1964, Lady Astor suffered a stroke. Before she died on May 2nd, it is reported that she called out for her late husband Waldorf. But her last known words, according to her son, were more lighthearted. Nancy reportedly opened her eyes, looked around at all her loved ones gathered at her bedside, and quipped, "Am I dying, or is this my birthday?" Over the course of his astonishing life, Winston Churchill spent 6 decades in the British Parliament, wrote dozens of books, won the Nobel Prize for Literature, was instrumental in winning the Second World War, and became Prime Minister not once, but twice. His life is also proof, if proof were needed, that depression is a disease that can affect anyone. Churchill was plagued by what he called his black dog during certain periods of his life. While the International Churchill Society feels his mental health issues have been exaggerated in recent decades, they admit he sometimes showed signs of depression. With this in mind, it makes Churchill's last words especially poignant. While one should be suspect of all last word claims, Churchill's are pretty impeccably sourced. In a 1965 article, the New York Times reported that the London Evening Standard had it on excellent authority that, despite being in a comatose state for the better part of 2 weeks before he died after suffering a stroke, Churchill had at one point regained consciousness, looked at his son-in-law, and stated, "I am bored with it all." Churchill died 9 days after uttering what are believed to be his final words on January 24, 1965, at the age of 90.
In the case of these celebrities, their final words left a pretty haunting impression among their family, friends, and fans. Apple co-founder Steve Jobs was not a celebrity in the traditional sense, at least not at the start of his career. Before the 2000s, Jobs was better defined as a tech entrepreneur and businessman, and of course he remained those things to the end of his life, a life cut short in October 2011 by pancreatic cancer. In the last decade or so of his life, as Jobs presided over Apple's rolling out of products like the iPod, iPhone, iPad, and ever-improved versions of the beloved Macintosh computers, he became a celebrity with an almost cult-like following. Clad in his signature black turtleneck, Jobs could command the attention of thousands in auditoriums, and many more watching remotely, as he unveiled Apple's newest creations and explained the implications they had for the world beyond.
Today, we're introducing iPhone 4, the fourth generation iPhone.
At the end of his 8-year battle with cancer, it seems as though he were looking into a world beyond as well. Jobs' last words, as heard by relatives, were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow," who seemed to have known the end was upon him. So too did James Brown, the hardest working man in show business. On the morning of Christmas 2006, Brown suffered congestive heart failure and uttered the words, "I'm going away tonight," to his longtime friend and manager Charles Bobbitt. Bobbitt initially didn't believe Brown was in any real danger, but quickly realized the severity of the situation when Brown slipped into unconsciousness and took his final breaths. The godfather of soul had spent more than half a century putting on high-energy performances with his band, and his infamous drug abuse had done irreparable damage to his body.
How did all of this trouble begin?
Living in America.
Brown was not the type to settle into retirement, though. Despite being weak, confused, and near death in the final days of 2006, Brown was scheduled to play a New Year's Eve show just a few days later. Looking back on the life and death of John Belushi, the latter of which occurred on March 5, 1982, it's hard to believe the actor and comedian was just 33 years old when he died. From never-to-be-forgotten roles in movies like The Blues Brothers and Animal House to his time as one of the original 7 cast members on Saturday Night Live, it's easy to think the man had been around much longer. More than a decade of hard drug use and a generally unhealthy lifestyle had wreaked havoc on the actor's body, and he looked to be a good decade older than he actually was by the last days of his life. His actual death came as a result of a drug overdose after he was injected with a so-called speedball, a mixture of heroin and cocaine. His friend and drug dealer, Catherine Smith, was the one who injected the narcotics into Belushi and was the person who heard his last words, "Just don't leave me alone." Smith did leave him alone, though, and would later serve time for manslaughter for the actor's tragic death. Despite becoming a real-life princess, the life story of Diana, Princess of Wales, was anything but a happily ever after tale. It was a life that commenced with an unhappy childhood in a broken home, and one in which she was rejected by much of her new family after marriage. It was a life in which a husband's affair led to a painfully public divorce, and a life cut short by tragedy. Unbeknownst to many, Diana did not die immediately following the tragic car crash both caused and documented by paparazzi who were tailing her car. In the immediate aftermath of the car crash, Diana reportedly had time to look about and, in confusion, say, "My God, what happened?" as she saw the lifeless bodies of 2 other passengers in the vehicle. The specific cause of Princess Diana's death was a tear to a vein in her lungs caused by the crash, doctors later found. It was a rare injury and, only adding to the tragedy, one that could have been avoided had Diana worn a seatbelt. When Heath Ledger died of an accidental prescription drug overdose in January 2008, he was at a point in which his career should have blasted off into the stratosphere. Instead, it was cut short at age 28. His final words show that the actor had no intention of dying, but he was indeed in some deep state of denial. On his last night, the Australian actor told his sister over the phone, "Katie, Katie, I'm fine. I know what I'm doing. Ledger, who had earlier said he just needed to get some sleep, confided to his sister that he had taken several different prescription medications and said his fateful and far from accurate last words in response to her warning him against mixing so many different drugs. The toxicology report run on Ledger found a deadly mix of sleeping pills and opioids in his system at the time of his death. When he died, Ledger was father to a toddler. He had an Academy Award-winning role as the Joker in The Dark Knight in the can, and every indication he believed he would indeed be fine and live on.
I think you and I are destined to do this forever.
The similarities between the lives and deaths of John Belushi and Chris Farley are so striking as to be unsettling. It's almost as if these two men's lives followed the same script. Like Belushi, Farley cut his teeth in comedy at the famed Second City Theater in Chicago, and went on to national and even international fame thanks to his years as a cast member on Saturday Night Live in the 1990s. Farley later ended up landing starring roles in several films that are unlikely to ever be forgotten, most notably his performance alongside SNL co-star David Spade in the comedy Tommy Boy. Tragically, Farley was just 33 when he died from a major drug overdose. His last known words are almost a word-for-word rehashing of Belushi's too. Farley's last words spoken to another person were, "Don't leave me." His final words were spoken to a reported sex worker who, before leaving him to die alone in his Chicago apartment, stole his watch and took pictures of the actor and comedian as he lay on the floor near death. The medical examiner said Farley had alcohol, cocaine, morphine, and marijuana in his system when he died, just months after participating in a rehab program. Everything about legendary fashion designer Coco Chanel was larger than life, right down to her last words. Born into poverty, Chanel pulled herself up by her bootstraps, using her wit, charm, and her undeniable ability as a designer and businesswoman to launch an empire that would include clothes, accessories, perfumes, and more. During World War II, Chanel became romantically involved with a Nazi intelligence officer, and when her nephew was imprisoned by the Germans, she even made a deal to use her contacts in European high society to work as a spy for the Nazis in exchange for his release. By the time of her death in 1971, the 87-year-old Chanel, or at least her brand, was a household name. Chanel clearly knew when the end was imminent, even though she didn't seem ill despite her advanced age. True to her character, her final words were a flourish that topped off an amazing, if controversial, life. On January 10, 1971, Chanel reportedly said to her maid, Celine, "You see, this is how you die." And shortly thereafter, she did just that, her bed becoming a deathbed. The last words spoken by legendary actor and comedian Groucho Marx would be haunting and tragic if spoken by most people lying on their deathbeds, but when Marx said, "This is no way to live," shortly before dying, he was making one last quip for the ages. So in this case, his last words are actually pretty hilarious, and it's okay to laugh. He was in on the joke. Marx was 86 years old when death came for him in 1977. He had been in poor health for 2 months, suffering from respiratory ailments that worsened into the pneumonia that would eventually kill him. Marx seems to have been well aware he was near the end, and his last words were perhaps the ultimate example of superb comic timing. Legendary singer Bob Marley was only 36 years old when he died in 1981, a fact that is hard to believe when one considers the outsized impact the man had on music and culture at large. What's less surprising is that his last known words, spoken to his son Ziggy, were sage and sorrowful, uttered shortly before succumbing to complications of a malignant form of melanoma that, over the course of half a decade, spread from one of his toes throughout his entire body. The cancer that killed Marley may well have been treated had he allowed the amputation of his toe, but his Rastafarian faith forbade such an operation. And also, in keeping with the type of messaging he had espoused his whole life, Marley's last words to Ziggy were, "Money can't buy life." One can speculate that he meant money cannot buy the treatment needed to sustain life, but more likely Marley meant money cannot bring happiness and fulfillment in life. Only a life well lived can do that.
My richness is life, forever.
Say what you will about John Lennon and Yoko Ono's relationship breaking up the Beatles or about Lennon's notorious arrogance and eccentricities, he was an excellent musician. And he was a human being who deserved to live a lot longer than he did. But due to the actions of Mark Chapman, who was determined to kill a famous person and resented Lennon's comments about the Beatles being bigger than Jesus, his life was cut short. Chapman shot Lennon in the back multiple times at close range on December 8, 1980. His last words were long thought to be the gut-wrenching "I'm shot, I'm shot." But it later came out that his last spoken word could also have been a soft "yes," whispered in response to being asked if he was John Lennon.
There's something morbidly fascinating about a criminal's last words. By definition, a death row prisoner has a better idea of when their time will come than the rest of us. They know when they'll make their final statement. Here we'll explore the haunting last words of criminals. Some criminal acts seem to come straight out of a monster movie. A person with no record of criminal activity seemingly out of the blue turns sadistic to the point of implausibility. At a glance, that's the story of Carla Faye Tucker. According to police reports, Tucker was out partying when she and her accomplice Danny Garrett decided the time was right to rob and intimidate 27-year-old Jerry Lynn Dean. Having stolen keys to Dean's apartment, they entered, and Carla Tucker took a pickaxe to his head and body 28 times, later telling friends she received a sensual thrill with every blow. Sentenced to death, Carla became a national media phenomenon, drawing interest with her charismatic persona and reported conversion to Christianity.
I'm so far removed from the person that I used to be out there.
The New York Times says there's an argument to be made that her sentencing even caused a dip in Texans' approval of the death penalty. In 1998, Tucker died by lethal injection, the first woman executed by the state of Texas in over 20 years. Depending on your point of view, her last statements were either reflective of her turn to religion or an ominous portent. "I will see you all when you get there. I will wait for you." The 1920s were a grim period for Ireland. Civic strife and gruesome bloody civil war led to sweeping reforms like the Army Emergency Powers Resolution of September 1922. Among other things, it instituted martial law across the country, allowing trial by court-martial, and made the possession of firearms by civilians an offense punishable by death. Robert Erskine Childers, meanwhile, was an Englishman, author, and soldier, a decorated Boer War and World War I veteran. It's unknown when exactly he became enamored with Irish nationalism, but he was passionate on the subject, smuggling weapons and even being accused of writing propaganda for the nationalist cause or the IRA during the war. A close eye was kept on Childers, and in November of 1922, his home was raided and he was arrested for possession of a revolver. Before being put to death by firing squad, he was reported to have shaken hands with his executioners and to have said, "Take a step or two forward, lads. It will be easier that way." In the pantheon of film and literature, you'd be hard-pressed to find a fictional criminal with a more cartoonishly abhorrent personality and lifestyle than the all-too-real Carl Panzram. According to his own writings, Panzram had killed at least 21 people by the end of his life, expressing no remorse. Writing about his crimes, including murder, robbery, and arson, he wrote, "For all of these things, I am not the least bit sorry. I have no conscience, so that does not worry me. I don't believe in man, God, nor devil. I hate the whole damned human race, including myself."
I think he was so full of hatred and with such a need, a compulsion to kill.
While he was never arrested for murder, Panzram garnered the death penalty when, while serving a 25 to life sentence in Leavenworth, he beat prison employee Robert Warnke to death with an iron bar, leaving the man's wife a widow and his son without a father. At his hanging on the 5th of September 1930, Carl Panzram kept true to form, spitting in the face of the man who put the bag over his head. Just before the execution commenced, he was asked if he had any last words. His response, "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill 10 men while you're screwing around." To his last breath, John Arthur Spenkelink swore he was innocent in the killing of 45-year-old Joseph J. Zemenkiewicz in February of 1973. According to Spenkelink, he had picked up Zemenkiewicz hitchhiking, then accidentally shot him in an act of self-defense after Zemenkiewicz sexually assaulted him in a Tallahassee motel. According to prosecutors, however, Spenkelink waited until Zemenkiewicz was asleep, then shot him in the head and back and beat him with a hatchet. Spenkelink then skipped town with another hitchhiker, Frank Broom, and the two were arrested for suspicion of armed robbery in California a few days later. John Spenkelink made headlines when he became the first man executed in the state of Florida after a 10-year moratorium on government-sanctioned criminal executions.
I don't think there's anybody on death row now that does want to die.
His last words before being electrocuted mirrored his claims that he was only being put to death because he couldn't afford better court representation. Capital punishment, then without the capital get the punishment. For the uninitiated, Eileen Wuornos was the subject of the 2003 motion picture Monster, where she was played by Charlize Theron. Her life was a series of horrifying events. Her father died in prison while serving time for child molestation, and her mother left her to be raised by an alcoholic grandmother and an abusive grandfather. Adult life didn't treat her much better, and she had soon turned to prostitution and petty crime. Over the course of 12 months in 1989 and 1990, she killed 6 men, and after property taken from the victims was recovered from several pawn shops with Wuornos' fingerprints, she was apprehended and confessed to the crimes, claiming each of the men had attempted to assault her and that she was acting in self-defense. Then, in 2001, Wuornos experienced a change of heart, volunteering for the death penalty and saying keeping her alive would be a waste of taxpayer money. CNN quoted her as saying, "I killed those men, robbed them as cold as ice, and I'd do it again, too. There's no chance in keeping me alive or anything because I'd kill again. I have hate crawling through my system." Before being subjected to death by lethal injection, Eileen Wuornos gave one final message, as chilling as it was mysterious. "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." A product of a time in American history when high-profile criminals were given nicknames like Dick Tracy villains, Barbara Bloody Babs Graham was a fascinating case. It's been noted by KCET she was something out of a noir detective story, a hypnotic beauty with a willingness to kill. As is often the case, the reality is a lot more tragic. Graham's mother, an unwed teenager, was sent to live at a reform school shortly after Barbara's birth, leaving Barbara to be raised in foster homes and orphanages. After an arrest for vagrancy as a teenager, Barbara was sent to the same school. She was released in 1939 at the age of 16, immediately married, and gave birth to her first child in 1940. A couple of divorces, a heroin dependency, and a remarkably pragmatic approach to a career in prostitution later, Graham was implicated in the death of a Burbank woman named Mabel Monahan during a botched robbery. While the evidence against her was largely circumstantial and dependent on the testimony of an accomplice turned state's witness, Graham was sentenced to death. After being strapped into the gas chamber, Barbara was reportedly told by a corrections official that taking a deep breath would mean the cyanide gas wouldn't bother her, to which she sort of brilliantly replied, "How would you know?" But her last words are the ones that really stick with you. Good people are always so sure they're right. The Salem witch trials were, to put it exceptionally mildly, not America's finest hour. Between February of 1692 and May of the next year, hundreds of people were accused of consorting with the devil, causing supernatural mayhem, and overall being whatever the opposite of peanut butter is to Puritanism's righteous chocolate. Sarah Good was one of the first unlucky ones. There were 2 cousins in Salem named Abigail Williams and Betty Paris, young women who wound up being, if their accusers were to be believed, 2 of the most bewitched and accursed human beings in history. While their peculiar behavior has in recent years been attributed to everything from epilepsy to bad wheat and even simply boredom, according to History of Massachusetts, it was blamed on witchcraft at the time, and the 2 put the blame specifically on 3 locals: a farmer named Sarah Osborne, a slave called Tituba, and Sarah Good. These would be the first 3 accusations in what would go on to be the Salem witch trials, a period of history synonymous with baseless claims and harsh, pointless punishments. Good, to her credit, was having precisely 0 of it. Her last recorded words before being hanged were, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." How do we define a war crime? War, it's been remarked, is hell. It is by its very nature a series of atrocities committed chaotically in the pursuit, theoretically, of higher order, a safer world. It might even seem after a cursory glance the term war crime was invented by someone who never themselves saw war. Isn't the term itself almost redundant? Or at least that's probably how Harry Breaker Morant felt when he was sentenced to die for war crimes committed during the Second Boer War. What exactly did the Australian soldier do that brought him to his end? Like with so many other corners of history, Executed Today says it depends a lot on who you ask. Some people say he was carrying out an unwritten order from British higher-ups to take no prisoners. Others will tell you that after Morant's friend was captured and mutilated, he went on a revenge killing spree, taking out prisoners of war. Really, the one thing everyone can agree on is the intensity of his last words shouted at the firing squad. Billy Conn Gardner maintained until the end he was innocent of the crime for which he was put to death. In 1995, Billy Gardner was put to death by lethal injection for the murder of Thelma Catherine Rao, a cafeteria worker at a Texas high school. According to the New York Times, Gardner conspired with the husband of one of Rao's colleagues and broke into her office while she was counting money, stealing $1,600 and shooting Rao in the chest. Rao passed away from her injuries 11 days later. At the time, Gardner was on parole after having been charged with burglary and assault, among other things. While on death row, Gardner was in regular correspondence with an attorney out of Wisconsin who tried unsuccessfully to convince the courts of Billy's innocence. Billy Gardner's last words before being executed were, "I forgive all of you. Hope God forgives all of you too." Then his mother, sitting in observation, said, "I've never been more proud of you than I am now." According to Texas law, any participant in a fatal crime could be sentenced to death. That's how G.W. Green wound up executed for a crime he didn't commit. In November of 1976, Green and 2 accomplices broke into the home of John Denson, a juvenile probation officer for the county of Montgomery, in the hopes of stealing his gun collection. Denson and his family were held at gunpoint, and Denson lunged at one of the intruders. He was shot 3 times by Green's co-conspirator, Joseph Starvaghi. Denson's wife and young daughter were told by Green and company to hide under a blanket during the time when Denson was shot. They later claimed that Green screamed at Starvaghi to shoot the 2 of them, but Starvaghi refused. In 1991, a stay of execution for Green was denied. Asked if he had any last words before being killed by lethal injection, he said, "Let's do it, man, lock and load." Then, as the drugs began to take hold, he muttered, "Ain't life a